Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for pre-order on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today my guest is Ciaran O'Keeffe. Ciaran is an Associate Professor of Education and Head of the School of Human and Social Sciences at Bucks New University. He is a popular skeptical voice on various paranormal shows and podcasts. Ciaran has become best known for his regular appearances on Living TV's Most Haunted, and later for featuring on the popular BBC podcast and TV show Uncanny, which is now in its second series on BBC Two. Ciaran's paranormal research has focused on testing mediums and psychics in the lab, and also fieldwork examining ghostly experiences. It has been reported in The Psychologist, The Times, The Independent, New Scientist, and elsewhere. He has been involved in many unusual projects. Physiological effects of infrasound in the Royal Festival Hall, ghost investigation of Hampton Court Palace, an exorcism training day, hostage negotiation simulations, and lie detecting for the film Spy Game. He has written a number of paranormal books, including GhostHunters, a guide to investigating the paranormal, and is a co-author of the key work Ghosted, exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. The main focus of today's fascinating talk is the ghost and poltergeist experience. Ciaran draws upon his extensive knowledge as a psychologist and parapsychologist, and on decades of talking to eyewitnesses of extraordinary and unsettling events. We discuss haunted people syndrome and why it's important to loosen up when considering fantastic claims. We also discuss a shared love of the 1984 movie Ghostbusters. Okay, Ciaran O'Keeffe. It's been a long time, I think, since
Very long time.
since we first met, and when we did first meet, I believe you were still doing your doctorate at the University of Hertfordshire under Richard Wiseman. So
That's right.
tell me a little bit about that, and tell me how you got interested in sort of parapsychology and paranormal stuff in the first place.
I guess I'll start from the beginning rather than going back to the PhD. I'll end up there potentially, but where does it all go back to? Phew. I guess it was there. It was always there. There was always an interest in the mysterious and ghosts from a very early age. I mean, I was reading horror short stories and ghost short stories at an early age, to the extent where my parents were genuinely concerned about what I was reading. So things like Stephen King short stories, A Skeleton Crew, I remember reading at a young age, but also dipping into things like M.R. James, H.P. Lovecraft, that sort of stuff. But and also kind of some schlock horror stuff, Guy N. Smith, and Sean Hudson, James Herbert. Again, stuff that I shouldn't have been reading, but I had a kind of a fascination with it and a voracious appetite for it. But you could almost fast forward a few years from that young age, and when I mean young, I mean like 8, 9 years old. Fast forward to then a period when Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World was gracing our televisions, and fascinated by what he had to say and by the mysterious things that he was presenting. And around that time, of course, 13 years old, I saw the movie Ghostbusters. And that also cemented an interest in paranormal stuff, but also ghosts. And, at a very early age, thinking I'd love to be a Ghostbuster. And I guess the journey wasn't direct, and I guess that's the same for most people. We always are told, aim and go for what you want, but it's not often a straight path. And so I went into a little bit of sound recording as a teenager, thinking that's what I was going to do, but then ended up doing a liberal arts education in America because I wasn't sure what subject it was that I wanted to do. Did I want to do psychology? Did I want to do music? Did I want to do parapsychology? And so ended up at Washington College in the States doing a liberal arts education, which meant I could take a number of different subjects. And I majored in psychology and music. And luckily for me, the faculty at Washington College were open to the idea of doing something parapsychological for my psychology thesis on the proviso that I would find a supervisor to help me with it. And so I ended up being kind of co-supervised by Dr. Cantamani, that was based at the Ryan Research Center, or was the Institute of Parapsychology in North Carolina, for about an 18-month period. So almost every other weekend I was driving down to North Carolina, quite a journey, and spending the weekend with her and with the library and meeting, great names, Richard Brownson, John Palmer, etc. But doing a lot of parapsychology stuff, a lot of research for my thesis. And then off the back of that, ended up doing a master's in investigative psychology, where I focused on psychic detection and the claim of individuals to help with criminal investigations for my thesis. And then that attracted the interest of Richard Wiseman, based at University of Hertfordshire, who then offered me the opportunity to do a PhD. Interestingly, with the PhD, CSI, Committee for Scientific Investigation, that was known as PsyCop, CSI, one of the largest skeptical organizations, although I know you and I have talked about this in the past, and I've talked about it with other people. It doesn't feel like necessarily a skeptical organization, if anything, maybe more of a cynical one. But it was half funded by them and half funded by the SPR as a PhD. And that for me was is an interesting moment, just that pure funding, because here were two different organizations, and it introduced me to the not introduced me, but got me thinking more about that belief spectrum and how too often we think about it as a dichotomy. But anyway, my PhD was focused on special claimants, psychics, mediums, and completed my PhD, finally got my Viva. I think it was almost a year after I completed, in 2005, and I was based at Liverpool Hope University at the time with other parapsychologists, Christine Simmons, Carl Williams, amazing respect for Carl and his work. Matthew Smith was there as well, Louis Sava. So these are names that people might know if they've delved into parapsychology in any great depth. So I was based there with them, and lots of things happened since then. So after that period, I was there for about 4 years, 3-4 years, and then ended up in France, of all places, University of Paris, and then down to University of Toulouse. And then after a few years there, and that was an interesting experience about parapsychology in that context, and we could talk about that at some point. But after that, then ended up coming back to the UK, and through various different paths ended up at Buckinghamshire New University, where I am now, where coincidentally a job that I had applied for in 2009 at Buckinghamshire New University, unbeknownst to me, Matthew Smith had applied for and got the job. And I had no idea. We'd lost contact for about a year. He got the job, and then another job came up a year later, and he recommended me to the head of department, and here we are, 12 years
Wow.
later. 12 years later, head of school of Buckinghamshire New University, the dizzy heights of senior management.
Wow. So it's sort of like a whirlwind academic career. There's a lot to pick up on what you said. So let's take it one by one.
Yeah.
I was really interested to hear about your sort of early sources, like the horror stories of people like Stephen King, for example, and James Herbert. Again, a common source because they were very influential on me. Similarly, Arthur C. Clarke. I think it was the World of Strange Powers series that I saw first. And one of the things that I liked about that series was that it was always open-minded, but again had that critical aspect too, so that they always treated their subject seriously and in a scientific way, which I think was very important.
Yes.
Because Ghostbusters, I think everyone around our age, every little boy around our age, loved Ghostbusters.
Yes, absolutely. It's just one of those films. And of course, there's been various sequels and remakes since then, but that original Ghostbusters was highly influential in kind of steering interest in the subject matter for I think a lot of us. Yes, it was a lovely jaunt and it was a comedy show, but comedy film. But there's something about the elements of it, and I still even I went into ghost hunting whenever it was a few decades ago. But I went into ghost hunting and made a lot of contact with Americans and American ghost hunters. And I was amazed at how they would avoid being associated with Ghostbusters or even admitting that they liked Ghostbusters. This is about 20 years ago now, at the kind of the peak of paranormal programs in the US and the UK, kind of when it started. And yeah, I was just amazed. They almost said, "Oh no, we don't want people talking about Ghostbusters or being associated with Ghostbusters because it gives us a bad name because people think that's what we do." Which for me, I just found absolutely bizarre. I was embracing it, and actually, my even though I'm dressed as a senior kind of management academic, my bag. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah,
Oh yes,
that's my bag. That's my bag.
the Ghostbusters patch.
Yeah, I mean that is my bag
Brilliant.
because it's just followed me through life. Just still fascinated by it. And yeah, I owe seeing that a lot into the to the extent where um, Ghostbusters 2, of course, there's a chat show, World of the Psychic, that
Yes,
Dr.
yes,
Venkman
yes.
presents, and I'm just waiting for that moment when that becomes reality, and there is such a show as that. It would be the pinnacle. I would absolutely love that to happen. The World of the Psychic, hairless cats. Yeah.
Yes, yes, me too. That's absolutely brilliant. I mean, Dan Aykroyd, who is one of the authors and also a star, he knows his stuff though, didn't he? Because
Yeah.
Richard Broughton told me that he used to visit the library. I think it was the one of the parapsychological libraries to do
Yes.
research.
Yeah,
So
absolutely, and very much connected to I think, even a member of the American Society for Psychical Research, but a lot of it coming from his dad as well, in terms of that interest in kind of the earlier family. But yeah, he definitely knew his stuff. And if you look at, there's a making of documentary which is lovely, called "Cleaning Up the Town," which a behind the scenes documentary and kind of a love letter almost to Ghostbusters that took about 5 or 6 years for the makers to produce. It was the Buenos, so the brother and sister team. And in that, they talked to Dan Aykroyd, they talked to loads and loads of different people involved in it. But you're absolutely right. What came out from the interview was this genuine passion and interest in the subject matter. It wasn't that it was led by comedy, it was led by his passion and interest in the society, and he even mentions the Society for Psychical Research within that particular interview. And so the fact that he even knows that, I think, is it's a big indication of his interest. Fascinating.
yeah, yes, it is. I mean, and you mentioned working with a lot of TV crews, and of course you've become well known for your media career. So there was Most Haunted, and then more recently you've been on Uncanny, and I think I actually saw you on stage at the Royal Festival Hall in last December, doing Uncanny live, which looked great fun to do. So tell me a little bit about. Well, tell me a little bit about how you got into Most Haunted, and then Uncanny, and then we can talk a little bit about what that taught you and what you've learned from that experience about spontaneous experiences, because you must have talked to a lot of people involved, and that must have influenced how you feel about them.
Absolutely, yeah. So I got involved in Most Haunted because of being at Liverpool Hope University, and Matthew Smith was there, and Matthew Smith was involved in Most Haunted way before I was, and his role was, the skeptic, almost wheeling on the skeptic at the end, who would be looking at tapes, kind of video clips in a studio and being asked to comment on them. I always called it the kettle moment, because there was a sense from viewers that they would watch the whole show, and then the last few minutes, the skeptic would be on, and so they'd take that opportunity to go and put the kettle on and put a cup of tea, because the skeptic never said anything interesting. At least that was the feedback I got from some of the fans. But I got involved because of Matthew Smith's involvement, and there were various moments that he said he wasn't able to do a couple of the episodes. Could I possibly do them? And it was pure convenience, so I was kind of subbing in for him. And then there was one live that happened down at King's Cross Station, and one of his children was due around that time. So I was asked to do it to cover for him, knowing that at any point he could end up going into hospital for the birth of one of his children. So I ended up doing that. But even still at that point, I was not a full member of Most Haunted. It was actually when they were looking at having Matthew involved in the show as an investigator. So there were others before him, Phil Lyman, Jason Carl, and they asked Matthew to join the team, and he gave it a go because, of course, it was his gig, and he ended up doing an investigation. I think it was around the Liverpool area, and he did this investigation, and he said it's not for him. And that was partly because of his interest. I think he was more interested in experimental research, and at the time, I think he was doing a lot of research with Louis Sava around presentiment, kind of precognitive stuff. And so they then came to me, but of course I was fascinated by ghost hunting. So it's a very different scenario for me. I just jumped at the chance and absolutely loved it. Really loved my experience with Most Haunted. Not the way I would conduct an investigation, let's be honest, but I think people realise that. But yes, got involved in it, and I was with it for about 4 or 5 years until 2010. Spring 2010, left there, and then didn't really do any paranormal TV for a few years. And out of the blue, I got a call from Danny Robbins, to get involved in a BBC Three series that he was doing called The Bullshit Detectives. And he wanted to look at mediumship, or specifically fraudulent mediumship. And was there a way that we could do that and televise that? And so we set up a little sting operation for testing mediums and filmed that episode, and we kept in contact since. I mean, that is a long time ago. It was maybe 17, 18 years ago that we did that. But we kept in contact since, and we did a little podcast together, Haunted.
Oh yes.
Which is almost the precursor to Uncanny. It's the same sort of thing. It's letting the stories be the focus and the person be the focus. So we did Haunted, and then about a year or two after Haunted, Danny came to talk to me at the university, and we were sitting in a cafe for about a day when he was talking to me about the dynamic of being in a married couple where the husband is a skeptic and scientist, and the wife is a believer and experiencee as well, which is my relationship that I've got now. So that's the husband and wife team.
Oh, okay.
And of course, he was doing that for research for 222, a ghost story, to kind of look at the dynamic and how that would work, the sort of conversations. And then we have the pandemic, so 2020, and a few months into the pandemic, he calls me up and he said, "Oh, Battersea Poltergeist, have you heard of that?" And I said, "Well, yes," thinking of the Harry Price case in Battersea that he investigated, not being fully aware of the one that he was referring to in 1956 in Battersea, focused around a young girl called Shirley. And he said, "Okay, well, here's a few of the details. I'll come back to you in 6 months." So he was basically saying, for now, here's the case. I want you to go away and do research on it for now, and I'll
Okay.
come back to you in 6 months and we'll record what you find. And that was the way that he conducted it, and kind of the way that he's conducted a lot of these investigations now. So we did Battersea Poltergeist, and almost the rest is history, because off the back of Battersea Poltergeist, we then did The Witch Farm, and we did a few things of Uncanny, and it just blew up in terms of popularity. It was just completely unexpected. And then off the back of that, of course, the TV series. But yeah, Battersea Poltergeist was first. Then I think he had started doing Uncanny as we were doing The Witch Farm.
Oh, I see. So that was it was a slightly separate show, and then Uncanny
Yeah.
was off the back of that.
Yeah, so the Battersea Poltergeist is a standalone 9-episode podcast that is not uncanny, but it's a case that is just dealt with across 9 or 10 episodes. The Witch Farm is exactly the same. It's a case that's dealt with across 9 or 10 episodes, completely separately to the Uncanny brand, or the Uncanny universe, as it's now being called by some people. So yeah. So the rest is history. There's something about the Battersea Poltergeist, though. If it wasn't for that, I don't know where Uncanny would be, because it's similar to Haunted, the first podcast that he did. Battersea Poltergeist captured the imagination of people at the time, because here was a family that was apparently plagued by a poltergeist, but also plagued by the press at the time, which meant they had to stay in the house constantly. They were almost prisoners in their own house. And that was the time when the pandemic hit, and people were listening to the podcast, and there was almost kind of an affirmation. People were going, "I know how this feels to be trapped in my own home." And it just captured the imagination of people, became really popular, and off the back of that, all the other series were commissioned. So yeah.
So briefly outline a little bit more about the case, because I must admit it wasn't one that I was familiar with until that podcast came out. Actually,
You mean the Battersea case?
yes, the Battersea one.
Yeah, Battersea Poltergeist case. So centres around 1956, I think it was, if I remember rightly. You have Shirley Hitchens, who's at the centre of it, a young girl, and a few little things start to happen in this Battersea house. They've got a grandmother, a mother, a father, and a brother, an adopted brother, living there. But the phenomena kind of starts off. The claim is the first phenomena is a key that appears in her bed from out of nowhere. So it just appears. She wakes up one morning and goes back to the bed, and there's a key there, and nobody can understand where the key is. That's the starting point, or at least that's the way Shirley reports it, as a starting point. And then you get other phenomena, objects moving, sense of presence, what is described in the case as little things, kind of little odd things that kind of gradually build. And it's a case that lasts 12 years, but it's a case of two halves. The first couple of years, I feel, is all the phenomena associated with a poltergeist case. And then what you get is a communication with the apparent poltergeist via letters.
Okay.
So they're randomly letters just start appearing, sent
Yep.
through the Royal Mail as well, which is just an odd aspect. And then she's replying in letters, and it almost takes on a farcical second half of the case, where the poltergeist identifies themselves as the lost prince, a French prince who was lost, which is historically accurate, but it's just very bizarre that a lost French prince would choose a random house in Battersea to plague it. So that's why I mean it's almost a little bit for me farcical, and I say that as part of the investigation. The second half is. The first half is intriguing.
But that's a bit like other cases, like the 1977 Enfield, isn't it? Where you had a similar pattern, where it starts off with this sort of Pult stuff, like the police officers seeing the chair move and all the bangs and all that stuff, and then suddenly there's a possession, which is seemingly taken almost to ludicrous lengths. So, has that happened in other cases as well? Is that sort of part of this general pattern?
I think no. It's not a standard for poltergeist cases. So I call it the farcical second half because it does feel that way, and I almost dismiss it within Battersea Poltergeist, which is probably not the appropriate thing to do, but I do it because it does feel farcical. You're absolutely right with the Enfield Poltergeist, Janet becoming apparently possessed by Bill and starting to speak in his voice. It just takes on a farcical element for me, and yeah, it's interesting from a psychological perspective. I don't think it's interesting in terms of the phenomena. Are there other situations where that's the case? Potentially, the Black Monk of Pontefract could be an example of that, where you've got some phenomena that's experienced, but it almost feels as though the second half of that, totally different to Battersea and Enfield, but almost to a farcical level, where I feel that the ghost hunters themselves are fueling the fire of phenomena, that there is a certain core group of phenomena that I think is really interesting in terms of that particular case. Not sure about the historical association with the monk, though, but still there's some really interesting stuff. But then it almost becomes totally exacerbated as ghost hunters descend on this little house, and stuff just starts happening, and then you get the first ghost hunters experiencing something that nobody has ever experienced before. You fast forward 3 years and people are talking about that phenomena experienced by the ghost hunters as being part of the core phenomena. And that's what I mean. It's almost like a farcical element. But beyond that, no, there are some lovely poltergeist cases. The Cardiff poltergeist is a lovely case, investigation by David Fontana. Got a lot of respect for him when he was alive. Fantastic investigation, written up in his book. That is not two halves. There's a classic poltergeist case which fundamentally is more about coins and objects being thrown, but also an interaction where objects are thrown and then objects are thrown back. But there doesn't feel like there's a second half to that. So it's not a standard to have a second half. I think what makes Battersea Poltergeist so interesting is it's almost was a forgotten case. And yet when you look at it and you look at the amount of phenomena that occurs and the duration of it, 12 years, it beats Enfield Poltergeist hands down.
Wow.
Yeah, really does.
Wow. So, I mean, that's really interesting because I know you tend to take a psychological approach as much, or perhaps more than a parapsychological approach. And I was interested in thinking of these cases in the context of some work you've done with, like, the psychologist James Horan. So you were one of the co-authors on a book called Ghosted, which discussed what you call haunted people syndrome. And I thought that it looked to me like a very useful way of framing ways of understanding what's going on in these cases. So could you tell me a little bit about haunted people syndrome and how you might apply it to cases that you see in, say, Uncanny or any of your other work?
Yes, I mean, but also I don't want to lose the thread of discussion that we've got going on, because one of your questions was around being involved in all of this. It's effectively spontaneous case research.
Yes.
And kind of my thoughts around spontaneous cases and what people are experiencing. So I don't want to lose that thread, and we can always return to that.
Okay.
But I think part of that is a part of my interest and my work with James Horan and Brian Lathe and others kind of almost stems from that experience of hearing people's experiences more so. So if you rewind back to kind of very early interest in ghost hunting and ghosts, yes, you are absolutely right, Matt. It's all around kind of the psychological side of things and kind of recognizing that I feel that there's a psychological element or psychological explanation for what's going on, and taking that very skeptical with a capital S route. But witnessing and hearing people's experiences more and more has made me more sympathetic and at times also empathic to their experiences. And whilst on the one hand, the research, for ghosted, but also HPS, haunted people syndrome, is research that is looking at natural explanations for what's going on, it's very important to also look at some of the wording of all of those papers that fed into the book Ghosted, because we are a team. It's not just James, Haran, and myself, but we are a team that have a spectrum of thoughts, perspectives, and beliefs about this stuff.
Yes.
If you rewind about 30 years, you could potentially have me as part of that team and the spectrum pushing for it's all bollocks. There's nothing to it. Forgive my language. There's absolutely nothing to it. But the research and listening to the experiences and all the work we did for HPS and for the Ghosted book and all of the articles that we did and various kind of spin-offs from that has left the tone of the book and tone of the conclusions of a lot of the papers to go, we think this is potentially quite viable, but we are open to other perspectives and we're open to
Yes.
possibility. A classic example of that we relay in the book is the paper that we did, Things That Go Bump in the Literature, which is a paper about the environmental explanations for hauntings. And effectively, we were acknowledging that James Haran had written a book or edited a book in 2000 called Hauntings and Poltergeists: A Multidisciplinary Perspective. And what we were keen to do 20 years on was to go, right, that book was in 2000 and it was making suggestions and proposals for possible theories as to why people were having these experiences, but also it included some of Robin Wooffitt's work around conversation analysis and kind of understanding the stories. And we wanted to go, right, 20 years later, what advancement has there been done in looking at the environmental explanations for haunting phenomena? And what we found 20 years later was that there hadn't been at all.
Wow.
At all. There had been some studies, but if you are being true to the skeptic label, and true in the sense that you are questioning the evidence, then you should also be skeptical in the sense that you are questioning the evidence that's presented by skeptics. And too often people are very accepting of things like infrasound. I've done it myself, put it forward as an explanation. Infrasound, also electromagnetic fields and geomagnetic fields, humidity, even kind of architectural design and kind of the way a building looks, all of those environmental variables. The research to show that there is evidence for these environmental variables causing people's experiences is just not there. It is not there. If we apply the same level of scrutiny that we apply to people's experiences, if we apply that to the literature and environmental causes for haunting experiences, it is not there. It would not stand up to any scientific examination at all. And one of the reasons why is the research into it is so little. The little research that there is not consistent in its methodology. And we know therefore that in science, if the research is not consistent in terms of the methodology, then it's very, very difficult to compare. Now, I'm giving you all of that context, and sorry for being so long-winded. I'm just
it's fine.
very, very, very preachy about this. I will talk in the media a lot about environmental explanations for hauntings, but I will also push on social media my paper on Things That Go Bump in the Literature, and I'll also push on in some of the media discussions that I have, saying it's one possible explanation. The point I'm trying to make is people think, absolutely, that's a great explanation for what's going on. It's raising the doubt, it's raising the question, but equally you've got to look at the evidence. and the evidence for environmental explanations. Now, I'm saying all of that because I think the work that we did in Ghosted, which looked at a whole load of different things, transliminality, looked at the environmental stuff, it looked at a number of different things, kind of personality types. Effectively, we were taking all papers that we had done over a 5-year period. So again, around the time of the pandemic, that year, 2020, well, it was 2019 into 2020, we got together as a team and started to publish papers and started to do research. And some of that research was starting off looking at the nature of experiences that people have. That if you look at research findings, you look at accounts of spontaneous witnesses, people that have these experiences, you find that there are trends in the data in terms of what people are experiencing. So there are two types, subjective and objective phenomena. And this is not a surprise to you, not a surprise to any listeners that have any kind of passing interest in ghosts and ghostly experiences. But effectively, we were saying there are 28 commonly reported signs of a haunting experience. So that was kind of the first part. And these signs could be easily classified as subjective or objective anomalies. And we term that just using the abbreviation S/O, subjective and objective. Subjective, of course, is more internal, psychologically, personally perceived experiences. A classic example would be sense of presence, but also unusual bodily sensations. But interestingly, we also debated whether apparitions should also be a subjective experience, because the way people describe it feels external. But often, and this seems like a core phenomena as well, often you get people reporting it, but others cannot see it. I mean, mediumship is a classic example. When mediums claim that they're communicating with spirit and they see a spirit in front of them, nobody else can see that. So it's very much, even though apparitions feel like they're more objective because they're seeing something in front of them, that potentially could be internal. It could be.
So there are weirder cases as well. I mean, I remember Tony Cornell, who's a veteran member of the SPR and Ghost Hunter. He had a case where two witnesses saw a sort of a person, I think it was sitting in a chair, and he didn't. And that's the kind of case I find interesting, because if it was just one person, you could say, well, it's probably a hallucination or something. But because it's two, it's like you think, what on earth is going on there?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a lovely example. And again, banding about these names almost in the hope that listeners go and do their own research. Tony Cornell and Alan Gould being two key names that have been quite influential for me quite early, very early on, but also within the last 20 to 25 years, researching poltergeist phenomena a lot more because of their classic book, Poltergeists. Some amazing work and some amazing findings in that. But you're absolutely right. You could interpret it as objective, external to the witness, that they're seeing something there, but it could also be subjective, and that's a classic example. We put that into subjective, so internal to the witness, and objective is external to the witness. Now that was kind of the starting point, and we were looking at the anomalies that were reported and how they grouped together, but also potentially any sort of hierarchy that existed. So common experiences, a haunt hierarchy, we called it. Common experiences at the bottom, and then you move up and they become less common towards the top. And it also started to realize, as we are looking at these sorts of experiences, that there were individuals where it looked as though they were having experiences frequently and having them, regularly. And I think that's where we were starting to then get a sense as a group, look, it feels as though we've got individuals that are not plagued by ghosts, but they are having frequent haunting experiences, and what might be going on there. And that kind of led us down that road to look at this thing, haunted people syndrome. Now, I will start off with a huge caveat around the term syndrome. You will not believe the late nights that we had as a team debating the term. And one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan, right? I'm a fan of the work, but I'm not an enormous fan of the idea of syndrome. And one of the reasons why is because in my university life, I deliver sessions on things like dissociative disorders, for example. I have sessions, workshops on that. But also, I am very slowly building an expertise in something called empty nest syndrome. Don't know if you're aware of that. This idea that a parent, they lose a child and then they start to experience various emotions and those sorts of things. Now, empty nest syndrome. If a parent, a child goes off to university, say, for example, a parent will experience sadness and loneliness. That's a perfectly natural reaction. A syndrome means that those experiences start to interfere with your day-to-day functioning. Right?
Yes.
That's what a syndrome is. So to give that term syndrome to a haunting experience or to a person and saying, look, this person has haunted people syndrome, you're effectively pathologizing it in a way. You're medicalizing it and saying, and that's why there was a real debate amongst the team as to whether it was appropriate, because even though there's an element of that is true, which is you're looking at individuals where it appears as though the haunting experiences are starting to interfere with their day-to-day functioning, actually it is not medicalizing or pathologizing it. I don't think it's appropriate for us to diagnose people as having a syndrome that relates to a haunting experience, because actually what we're doing is we're using syndrome in a slightly different way, which is the word syndrome is used to indicate signs and symptoms of something. And so it's signs and symptoms of having regular haunting experiences. That's really what it is. And that you can take all those subjective and objective anomalies and apply them, to people's experiences and map them in that way. But you can also map personality types as well. And that's ultimately what's at the heart of HPS, is saying that there are particular people who have particular personality types, I hesitate to use that, but they score highly on various things. So transliminality is one, but there are other aspects of their makeup that means that there is a common type that exists when it comes to haunted people syndrome, and that is that regularity of hauntings. It's different if somebody says, oh, I've had 5 experiences, one here and one a few years ago, or I had a significant experience. That's different from that regularity, and I think that's the distinction that we've got to make, so much so that we are very, very clear in our writing of it, both in terms of the article but also the book, to emphasize that point, that when we're talking about syndrome, we're talking about a set of signs or symptoms that occur together to characterize a particular abnormality. I hate that word, but to characterize that. It's the signs or symptoms of it that kind of characterize it. So I think that's the key. Some authors in the team were looking at it almost like a disease model. And I was going,
problematic.
Really problematic. So really problematic. But that's, and it is very problematic. But also the lovely thing about the research team that Jim Moran has headed up is that you get that spectrum of perspectives. So, there'll be some papers that are very much disease focused kind of perspective, and people then can go, I'm opting out of that. That's not me. I'm not happy with that. Whereas there'll be the other papers where we'll have a lovely debate about what's going on, and all of the beliefs and perspectives will be represented in that particular research. And that's what Ghosted is as a book. It took all of the papers that we had done over 5 years and put them into a book that was maybe more approachable, kind of almost trying to take what are potentially quite complex articles and put them into a book so it's more approachable for people, but also to give a voice to the various authors in the book so that you've got your different perspectives, and introducing concepts, I think, to a wider audience that you and I are potentially very familiar with, and colleagues and friends that we've known for years. Christine, for example, and the amazing work that she does over in West Georgia and has done for years around transliminality, for example, and this kind of boundary idea, I think, which is a lovely, lovely concept to look at.
Oh, it is. I actually interviewed her last week, so that's going to be coming on the show as well. And I think there's a lot to pick up there. I mean, I'm increasingly conscious of not pathologizing the sort of experience, because it's partly because I've been looking more at sort of anthropological work and cross-cultural studies. And I think I was looking at, for example, Jeremy Narby's work with ayahuasca and tobacco shamans, and he's done a lovely book where they have they have one chapter on the indigenous perspective and then one chapter on the scientific. And I'm thinking there are some statements made by, say, the tobacco shamans that don't fit into my worldview. So, for example, there was one who said that his father died after his soul went into a jaguar that got hunted by some farmers. And I was thinking, you've got to respect the perspective, but how do you approach that? And my conclusion is you have to loosen up a little bit and be tolerant of other people's perspectives, but it's not always easy. And I find that the same with witnesses as well,
Yeah, but I'm going to correct you slightly, because because I think what you said about loosening up, perfect. I love that phrase, and I'm going to steal it from you. I think that has been my journey over the last 25 years, is that I have loosened up 100%. The word that I'm going to have an issue with is tolerate other people's perspectives. So I get what you're saying, and there will be circumstances where I will definitely tolerate other people's perspectives where they come from a place of ignorance and bias. That would be me tolerating. Yeah.
Yes.
And they haven't even attempted to look at at the research, or attempted to read a book. Even in some circumstances, there will be an element of toleration that I will have there. But beyond that, when I listen to people's accounts, when I listen to alternative perspectives from other researchers, I have loosened up. And it's not about tolerating, it's about wanting to listen and wanting to genuinely hear what they're saying. And I think that's the difference, and that's the change that I've made, is genuinely wanting to listen and hear what they're saying. And likewise, if I'm doing that, hope for an equal respect, if I'm in conversation, that they would do the same for me. Fascinating. Just as an aside, I hope you don't mind me going off on a tangent. You mentioned about
it's fine.
The anthropological perspective and the ayahuasca stuff. There's an interesting development that's happened in my career. So whilst I would definitely call myself as a parapsychologist because of the research that I do, but also a ghostbuster for obvious reasons, I've also become quite interested and involved in more spirituality perspectives. So I am a course leader for a master's in spirituality, ecology, and mental health, for example, at the university.
Brilliant.
Which combines those three things. And on that master's, we have David Luke come and talk to the students about his research. We both know David. Jack Hunter as well, the para-anthropological perspective. Yes. So we get individuals, but also wonderfully within that master's, the discovery that various NHS trusts, and it's only a couple, 2 or 3, who have employed spiritual leads within their trusts, which is a fascinating development that's happened over the last 5 to 10 years. These are not replacements for chaplains. These are individuals that see the benefit of engaging with people's spirituality as an attempt to try and get them to help with their own rehabilitation and recovery. It's almost recognizing things like various perspectives on energy. Anyway, I mentioned that as one particular development, which kind of relates a little bit to what you're saying because of David Luke and his research with psychedelics, and he talks about those naturally occurring psychedelics. But also, we've just submitted a PhD, chap called Ross Bartlett, that did a PhD on OBEs, out of body experiences, and within his PhD, he did something quite controversial, which was he went out to Peru to investigate the ayahuasca ceremonies, and as part of that, interviewed people that were involved in it, but also became part of the ritual himself as well, kind of an almost ethnographic approach. Where am I going with this? I'm going with this because so psychedelics and taking psychedelics is so far removed from me. It cannot be any further removed from me. It is not something that sits comfortably with me at all in terms of taking substances and where it takes you. But it typifies the sort of person I've become, which is I've loosened up to the extent where I can genuinely sit down and hear David Luke talk about this stuff for hours, and I'm just fascinated by it. It still doesn't mean I'm suddenly going to drink the Kool-Aid or take, ayahuasca and see what happens. I'm not doing that. But it's just absolutely fascinating. That loosening up and listening to other people's perspectives has been, a wonderful development that's happened over the last 25 years.
Well, that's brilliant. I mean, you probably already know, having listened, one of the themes of this podcast, and actually the book that I've written is that I've been trying to find the worth in these kinds of experiences. So, I mean, we're talking about sort of spontaneous cases today, but, I think a lot of the emphasis that I'm thinking about is in terms of, well, spirituality, meaning, things like transpersonal experiences. There's this hugely broad spectrum of human experience.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of challenge that I was setting myself. So that's sort of a major theme of this podcast. But one of the concerns that I was having with the pathologization, and also the sort of believer versus skeptic kind of binary, which I think perhaps we both find a little bit simplistic. I mean, I understand that it has a functional use. So on Uncanny, you tend to be with team skeptics. So which again is fine for the format, but at the same time, the sense, particularly reading that book Ghosted, I think the team says at one point they're trying to avoid a dogmatic approach that says an experience is either completely paranormal or completely mundane, and instead adopt a more loosened up and open approach.
Yes, absolutely. We very much see eye to eye on this, in that we describe this as a spectrum of belief. You and I would describe it, but too often there is that dichotomy of team believer and team skeptic, where team skeptic is thankfully different. I would say in the past, skeptic has been misunderstood as being cynic and cynical. The word skeptic has been used in that way. So coming into Uncanny and having team believer and team skeptic has been useful, because people are starting to see, well, team skeptic doesn't necessarily mean that you are cynical or closed-minded to all the various perspectives and a paranormal perspective, but it just means you're questioning, really.
Yes.
That's what it means. And I think it has been quite a journey from the start of Uncanny and Battersea Poltergeist to get there, but I think people get it. In the past, there has been too often a believer-skeptic battle, and whilst the series plays on that a little bit, I think what's lovely is that you get people saying, oh, I'm not sure where I am. I flip-flop between the two. I'm saying, so what? It doesn't matter. Or be hashtag team don't know. It doesn't matter. It genuinely doesn't matter. You don't join a team and suddenly now you're stuck there and that's it. So I'm glad you got that same sort of idea out of Ghosted. It's not, it doesn't feel, I mean, we're still doing some lots of research and are doing some recent papers actually that have been just accepted for publication, kind of taking some of the phenomena further, looking at things like magic flights and time slips and various things like that. We didn't make a conclusion in the book Ghosted. It feels that way to an extent because we're presenting all the papers and there's a lovely theme as we go from kind of the subjective objective anomalies into kind of a haunt hierarchy, and then we go into kind of haunted people syndrome and then look at the environmental aspects. But as you go through, maybe more towards the end, there's the realization for readers that no, actually we are effectively as a team are fans of it all and fans of all perspectives. The very fact we make recommendations towards the end of the book of various organizations that can be done, but also bring in, interesting papers and interesting voices. I think it's the best way to be. Really
Yes, I do.
it's the best way to be. You've got to be open to it all. And I think that kind of almost multimodal, modal's the wrong word, but kind of, multimodal perspective of saying, in some instances, could be paranormal. In some instances, probably more mundane. In some instances, it could be a mix of them. The very fact when we started off talking about Battersea Poltergeist, and I said there was a farcical second half, right? There's a prime example of a case where people are genuinely surprised when they ask me, out of all of the Uncanny universe, the whole lot, Battersea, Witch Farm, Uncanny, all of the cases, are there any particular moments where you think, that could be paranormal? And I said, well, yeah, there's countless examples. Well, what's the best? What's the best one? And I really surprise people because I go back to a little bit of phenomena that was reported in the Battersea Poltergeist that was almost brushed over.
Okay.
And I made a point of saying it to Danny at the end of the show. I said, no, I'm going to go back to this little. People talk about spontaneous fire happening in the kitchen, or kind of the girl Shirley levitating on the bed and various things of that sort. Forget that. And I'm not dismissing it as not being paranormal. You're asking, me, pushing me into a corner and going, what phenomena for you is the most interesting, potentially paranormal? Slippers. It was the family. You've got an entire family witnessing slippers fall off a table and walk out of the room. Now, if the account had been, which it frequently is in cases, poltergeist cases, if you get a family reporting, wow, slippers fell off the table, they flew across the room, immediately you go, okay, really interested, because if they did actually fly, fascinating. But the way you're describing it, immediately I kick in with my eyewitness testimony issue to go, somebody saw it and it fell off, and then people go, did you see it? Oh, yes, I saw it. Oh, didn't it fly? All of this kind of, not contagion type discussion, but you're influencing each other's testimony.
Yeah.
How can you explain a pair of slippers falling off a table and walking out of a room and 5 members of the family seeing it and all reporting it in exactly the same way? Unless there's collusion, unless they got together and went, you know what? All of this stuff is happening around us for 12 years. And we're going to make up this one bit of phenomena, given that we've got lots of other instances of other phenomena where people have, other witnesses, external witnesses come in. That's what I mean by you've got to be open to it. I've talked to other well-known skeptics who will remain nameless and said about the slipper incident, and it is dismissive, going, well, they were lying, or they're making it up. And you go, what?
Yeah.
Really? Why? How can you possibly say that?
I think that's it. It's why I think there's two modes of things here, and actually, I write about it a little bit in the book. With skepticism, I find that there's one approach which I find quite constructive, and the other which I often must admit that I don't. The first approach is sort of informed critique. So that's where you have a look at a case or an experimental setup, and you say, well, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. There might be this potential alternative mundane hypothesis that perhaps an investigator hasn't thought of. I think that can be very powerful, and it has been very powerful. The second one is sort of the boundary work approach, which is where we say this is all pseudoscience, it's nonsense. And basically, as you said, whenever a claim is made, a mundane explanation is trotted out, no matter how implausible, so that basically the problem can be contained and we don't need to worry about it anymore, I think is often the I find that much less helpful than this much more informed and collaborative approach.
Yeah, exactly. We had a lovely conversation the other day when we were filming one of the follow-up shows for Uncanny, where we were talking about ergot poisoning and talking about it in the context of Salem witches as a possible explanation for what was going on, and then talking about this particular ghost case and saying, what else could be going on, Ciaran, in terms of a scientific explanation? And I went, I don't know, but potentially the symptoms point to that sort of poisoning. Oh, okay, explain a little bit about this. So we chatted about Salem witches, and then the question was, so you think that could be a possible? And I said, yeah, but it's that word, possible. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it is. Oh, so you're saying everybody was eating moldy bread? Well, no. As you start to then investigate the possibility that this might be the case, if you've got one person and they're having these experiences, it'll be difficult. It'll be potentially easier to explain that form of poisoning if there had been any issues with wherever the ergot came from. So that could be. But as you build up and investigate it more, and you go, well, we don't have one witness, we have two, we have three, we have anything up to 10. And so, although it's a lovely possible explanation within the context of Salem witches, it potentially works within that context because of the historical setting and because of what they were doing. You move that scenario where you've got multiple witnesses, 10, 15 plus, to the modern day, and you go, well, no, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Even just that, it doesn't stand up. Oh, but you're saying they all had moldy bread. No, I'm saying let's start at looking at possibilities. That is really, really useful. The possibility that you've got somebody here that is experiencing a ghost. The possibility that somebody is in communication with a spirit from the afterlife. The possibility that this is a clairvoyant projection from their head. The possibility that something in the fabric of the building is causing a replay of a ghost. The possibility that it's infrasound. The possibility that it's all of these things. And then start to then investigate and analyze each of these things and go, infrasound, potentially interesting, but we now know from the research the evidence is not there. And I had a PhD student working on this to go, infrasound is not the cause of haunting experiences. It could potentially be a trigger, or it could potentially be an exacerbator. So if people already have existing experiences, you add infrasound to the mix and it intensifies the experience. But it's not the cause of the experience. And so that's what I love about taking this perspective of loosening up to all different perspectives and investigating them all and just throwing them out there as possible questions and saying, there you go. Here's another possible one. Okay, Ciaran, you say that, but we've got multiple witnesses. Great. Okay, we've got multiple witnesses, so that doesn't hold up then, that explanation. So then let's talk about other possible things that are going on. I love the discussion and I love the debate rather than there being what appears to be the case and has been in the case in the past in a lot of media circles, but also on social media, is a battle, almost like a toxic battle.
Yes.
Just avoid that. It's not helping. It's not moving the field any further forward, but it also doesn't help you get answers.
I agree. And I think our focus shouldn't be who's right. It should be understanding these complex human experiences in a more in-depth way. I mean, a couple of things to say is that I think I wrote in an article in Fortune Times, which I think maybe some readers might have misunderstood, but I said I have a Mulder and Scully in my head, so when approaching these cases, you have the person who maybe not wants to believe but wants to entertain possibilities, and then the other person who goes, no, that can't possibly be true. Have you thought of the But I've mentioned this before on the show, but Jim Matlock's in-depth course on reincarnation courses, so that included looking at the cases in depth. And I found myself, the more you look at that sort of case, and I suspect you might find the same when you're looking at these cases in depth, you go beyond again, the crude binary of believer or skeptic, and you actually have to become a little bit more laid back. Just understanding the complexities of the cases, often they can't be shoehorned into that crude binary.
Yeah.
Because they're too complex.
Yeah, exactly. And I said it at the very end of the Ghosted book. At the very, very end, James Horan said, I want each of you in your bios to just give a few lines to say, what is your perspective on all of this? Having done all of this, what is your perspective? And my line, I'll try and quote it because I've said it quite a few times, but effectively, the best evidence-led explanation for ghostly experience is that there is a complex mix or complex interplay between the environmental and the psychological variables, but also possible paranormal processes. And that's my line. And that's my line that I'm going to stick to. And people say, oh, do you think we'll ever find out if there are ghosts, or do you think you'll ever prove EMF? And I go, I don't know. I don't know, but isn't the journey amazing?
You know? Yes, I agree. And I think in some ways, again, that question's, for me, it's too crude and it doesn't reflect the complexities. Because I always think, I know we might not know if there's the traditional idea of a ghost, but we do know there's this complex ghost experience.
Yes.
And for me, it's all about understanding. It's the same actually with the other things in this field. So mystical experience, or the possession experience, or any of these, extraordinary human experiences that we talk about, you can look at the experience and you can try and really get an in-depth understanding. And that's a really useful, I think, thing to do.
It is. And you will be pleased to know that when I started at Buckinghamshire University, one of the things I did was work with Matthew Smith to develop a third-year psychology module called Exceptional Human Experience. Now, we could have so easily developed a third-year module called Parapsychology, but how limiting would that have been? But for us to develop a module, Exceptional Human Experience, that covers a whole array of experiences, everything from the overview effect to yoga and meditation to peak experience to flow, but also, exactly like you said, haunting experiences, demonic possession, you name it, OBEs, NDEs. But quite crucially, we've embedded it in a BPS, British Psychological Society, accredited degree, that we have a module tackling this sort of stuff. And a lot of people at the time, and this is, bear in mind, this is almost 15 years ago, said, why are you doing that? Why are you putting that into a mainstream psychology degree? Obviously, you're going to be doing it and explaining all of the experience, explaining them away as being down to simple psychology. And we said, no, that is exactly the opposite to what we're doing. We're presenting these experiences, and in the room, you have students that have been studying a psychology degree for 3 years, and this is their final module, and you are saying to them, now we invite informed debate. What do you think?
Yeah.
Simple as that. We're not there to say, this is how you explain near-death experiences. Because again, there could be a number of different things going on, but we don't say that. It all starts with, this is the experience, and this is how some people have described their experience, and now what do you think? And potentially out of that discussion comes some fascinating disclosures where people talk about their own experiences. But it's done in a respectful way, so that even if you are somebody, a student who does not believe in demonic possession, you are still respectful of people that do, because in that room you have got a whole variety of religious beliefs, a whole variety of people with backgrounds that have certain beliefs or perspectives on this. So it has to be done in a respectful way. Now, why are we doing this? We're doing this for 2 reasons. Number one, because we're big fans of Rio White and Exceptional Human Experience anyway.
Yep, me too.
Just wonderful stuff, absolutely wonderful stuff. And actually, we've had Susan Brown remotely talk to the students as well, and kind of various people that know or knew Rhea very well, Lizette Coley as well, and various others. So we have these individuals talking. So we're doing it on one hand because we're fans of EHE, but what do we also do? We're building that room of respect for each other's perspectives. And I never use this phrase until we've just had a talk, effectively trying to get psychology students who are the next generation of psychologists, who are the next generation of leaders within psychology, potentially getting them to loosen up.
Yeah.
It's a lovely phrase. I absolutely love it. But that's effectively what we're doing. Respect each other's perspectives. Be open to discussion. Agree. It doesn't matter. Agree to disagree, but also loosen up to all the different perspectives that you're going to get.
I think that's so constructive, because when you look at the full spectrum of exceptional human experiences, and that includes some of the things we've been talking about, it's so broad. And I think this has always been my concern. If you're just writing a lot of this stuff off, you're actually writing off not only a big chunk of human experience, but also a chunk of human experience that actually has a lot of significance for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, any psychology worth its salt, I think, needs to engage it in a like you said, a respectful and perhaps pluralistic way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of the show, and I happen to know that the new series of Uncanny is now on BBC Two, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
But what else are you working on at the moment, and sort of what projects have you in the pipeline?
Well, there's two that kind of relates to what we're talking about. I mentioned it in passing. Looking at magic flights or dimensional slips. So, with people or listeners might be aware of a time slip where you're effectively innocent in somewhere, and then suddenly in front of you, everything is suddenly in the past. Bold Street in Liverpool is a classic example, having been there, studied there at my master's and also worked there. Bold Street is a street in the centre of Liverpool, and there have been reports of people walking in that street, and suddenly they look around and everybody is dressed as they were back in the 1950s. And there is old cars around, and then the shop that was a bookshop, a contemporary bookshop, is now suddenly a clothes shop. And then they walk in and they go, this is very weird. And then suddenly it goes back to being modern day. That's a time slip. So I'm doing a project looking at that, but also looking at something we have termed dimensional slips, which is a geographical displacement that can happen. So it can be a combination of a time slip, but also geography. But fundamentally, it's a geographical slip within haunting cases. So where people have reported that they've suddenly appeared somewhere else. Interestingly, it happened in Enfield, and people just aren't aware of it. But it happened in Enfield, where effectively you have at the centre of the case Janet, who reports that she suddenly appeared in the bedroom next door, and the neighbours in that house were visiting her house downstairs, and she's suddenly transported into the bedroom upstairs, and she relays to them an accurate description of what was on the floor in that bedroom, which they said, how would you know that? Because we knocked that over when we were in the rush to get out the door to come and see you, and we knocked that particular object, and it's on the floor. How would you have been, little things like that. So there are quite a few cases of that. So that's one thing that I'm looking at. The other thing that I'm looking at, despite everything we're saying about loosening up, I'm looking at demonic possession. And I'm working with a neurologist in America, and we're looking at something called anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, which became part of the neurological narrative back in 2007, 2008. So prior to that, it was not known at all.
Okay.
But you look at the symptoms of that, and it bears an uncanny resemblance to some demonic possession cases, but only some. It's not a catch-all explanation, but it could potentially explain. Oh, and of course, the lovely thing about it is it's 2007, so you've got a lovely example of science prior to 2007 misdiagnosing people that were coming into hospital, and there's sometimes epileptic type symptoms, but there's no epileptiform activity on the brain scan. And so hospitals kind of struggling with how do we diagnose this person, because of course anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis was not known then. So that's a project I'm working on. And then the bigger project is a book. So Ghosted was obviously a conglomeration of all of the research articles that we've done, and was a lovely experience to put it down on paper. I have been asked to write a popular book about haunting experiences and kind of making it accessible. So there are various things that we've talked about today that would be lovely to transfer to a book, almost telling my experience of my journey, but at the same time an opportunity to kind of make people aware or educate people about different perspectives on various aspects of hauntings, like a very simple one. And here's a simple one that we didn't discuss, and this is another chat that we can have that I'm sure we've talked about in the past. I have grown to dislike the distinction between hauntings and poltergeists in much the same way that Alan Gould and Tony Cornell came to that conclusion, that we shouldn't distinguish between the two. There's too much overlap that occurs between cases. And actually, I think it's potentially dangerous to label a case as a poltergeist case very early on when you're investigating it, because effectively it means that you may miss phenomena because it doesn't come under the poltergeist label, or you may change the weighting and the importance of phenomena. So sense of presence, for example, is not necessarily within that poltergeist framework, a sense of presence. It comes more under a haunting framework. Well, if somebody reports a sense of presence, why would you ignore that? Why would you give that a lesser weighting to more objective phenomena simply because it doesn't fit within that poltergeist? So it's things like that, and discussing that in a ghost book, and that's what I would like to do. If you had magical powers and could grant me more time in my life, then that's actually what I would do, which is why I'm incredibly jealous of your book, that, by the way, looks absolutely fascinating, and I will definitely buy a copy and really look forward to reading it, especially after our chat today.
Oh, well, that's kind. I mean, to be honest, as I've been doing these interviews, my perspective shifted slightly, but I still think, I think it's going to be a bit of a Marmite book. So some people are going to like it, some people aren't. But my aim with it was really to start triggering debates and attempting to reframe a lot of these issues in sorts of the ways that we've been talking about, because I think without getting too heavy, I think we're at a pivotal point in history where it's a good opportunity to start rethinking some basic assumptions about people, about the world. And for me, we talk about, I think this can get lost sometimes in chats about the paranormal. Very often they're trivialized and marginalized, but my thinking is, I've always found, and I think a lot of people find this sort of topic a really good place to ask the big questions, about the nature of human beings, who we are. And that doesn't mean you're looking for a dogmatic answer, but it does mean you're looking for exploration.
Yes.
So you don't have a book contract yet?
No, I don't. No, I don't. It will happen at some point, but I've got to put pen to paper at least a little bit and kind of get, a framework, a proposal down that is more than just I want to write a book. The other thing is I've got a huge amount of data on a sentence, which is, if I were a ghost, ... So about 10 years ago, I set up just kind of an online survey saying, complete this sentence, if I were a ghost ... And because it's been around for about 10 years, I have hundreds of responses from people, just members of the public from various professions all over the place, but also key individuals that people will know. Stephen Fry, Andy Nyman, the magician behind the development, Darren Brown's work, Stephen Colgan, one of the QI elves, Jane Goldman, Jonathan Ross's wife. I mean, it's a huge array of perspectives there, and I did it kind of as a little bit of this will be fun, but actually the answers have been incredibly revealing. Some of them have been very short, but some of them have come from perspectives where they have openly declared, I don't believe in ghosts at all. But given the scenario of having to complete the sentence, if I were a ghost, has made them think what they would do. And I've been able to follow up and go, but you said you don't believe in it. So how are you then able to build this lovely narrative in the story about what you would do? How can you kind of rectify what appears to be a bit of a conflict? Well, it's not a conflict because, I feel like this could protect. So you're saying you don't believe in it, but then having to think about it more, you're now more open to the possibilities. So anyway, roll on the end of this year and we'll see if any of that gets published.
Well, I do hope that you get that book out because it would be great to have you on the show again to chat about it.
I would love to.
It's been great. It's been a great chat, Ciaran. I hope you've enjoyed it, and it would be great to see you on the show at some point in the future.
No, it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been a great chat, some amazing questions, and it's been lovely to see that definite synergies there in terms of how we're thinking about things. So yeah, definitely love to come back on at some point.
Well, Ciaran O'Keeffe, thank you very much. What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. What Lies Beyond the book is now available to pre-order on Amazon and other retailers.